he is no longer that sort of star power on that. So this illustrates a shift of vision and values in terms of how Stratford presents itself. The other interesting thing now is that they're looking more holistically at the slave narrative. They're also looking again at their own stewardship story. The regents from each state that came and stayed in cabins twice a year, who helped to enable colonial revival gardens by firms like Init, Shenty, and Webble, they're broadening their period of significance. And they are revisiting their NHL at this time. So then, how do we adopt a holistic stewardship ethic? Now, these of course were taken from my most recent visit, and it got me thinking, because one is just more beautiful than the next. Is it easier to preserve and restore interior furnishings? And I'm sure if there were people that just did that kind of conservation, they would argue with me, but I would suggest there's a different level of dynamism that they're dealing with. So it's time to move outside. Now, these 4 standards, which are in the report I'm not going to read, I think that these really relate to a lot of the issues that you're grappling with today. And I would ask you to look at these and ponder if you think this is a launching off point, because I do think that in terms of Olana's landscape, because of the amount of change, for example, the 60 acres of secondary growth, you're going to have to deal with rehab solutions. It's not just opening a view shed. What are the environmental, ecological, historical, scenic ramifications of that intervention? It's complicated stuff. So here's how I think about landscapes. I refer to the 4 C's, this is in the report: collections, living and non-living; community in the broadest sense of the word, everyone that lives and works and plays, the people sitting around this table. I talk about buildings as containers to subordinate them in the landscape, which I think, as significant as the buildings are, they are landscape features. And then finally, context, as previously mentioned, physical and historical, so setting and landscape painting, for example. But when you start to look at something like crushed shale and what that means, how do you make decisions? If you're the Ernest Hemingway house and it's all found material, then that actual material is critical. If you're a historic estate that had an embedded aggregate coal walk, that material is critical. But what if you are a shale surface? In Boston's Emerald Necklace, you can see here, they're chip sealing it and rolling it in. And that is clearly one solution. You don't have the crunch. Is the crunch important? Is the crunch on foot? Is the crunch in a donkey cart? Is the crunch in a golf cart? Is the crunch in a larger vehicle? What is that, and how does that contribute? How important is it that that was quarried on site? All of those questions have to relate to a larger lens. And then you have situations like this, and I would argue that what you want in a situation like this is a dignified arrival experience. And in particular, when you look at this, there's so much going on here. Why would you want to even compete with that? If you say, okay, historically it was shale, it's almost like it's a continuous, uninterrupted surface. So if it becomes something more dignified, using more durable materials, if this space becomes a center of energy with a future cafe and a guest shop, what does that mean? How do you look at that other than, oh, I like that or I don't like that? Should it be scored? Should there be different types of paving materials? Where do they meet the house? Where, all of those sorts of questions. I couldn't help but show all of this, you know, and not forgetting that this is how people arrived, and now they don't. And so the question then becomes, if we use different materials today to address this, and then we have an off-site visitor site at some point in the future, do we use materials holistically as a visual cue to tell people, you're in a space that has changed? So what is that as a philosophy statement? And how do we use that then, working with the best and brightest people as you have on cornices and wallpaper and rugs? You know, why is it that when we design parking, we somehow feel this need to sort of have homage to something ye olde? Now granted, we could have fun laughing at this, the state did this, and I know I'm safe taking this on and I won't insult anyone here, but the reality is, what's the philosophy for parking? How do you determine the sites? And the other thing is, this is so close to the house, is this about returning an integrity of setting to the house? To get things like this away, and to have people have a dignified arrival experience. How does that relate to these visions and values? And vegetation, I could come and do another whole lecture on just vegetation at Olana, and it's really complicated, and I can't serve it justice in just a matter of minutes. But I mean, for example, we all know that, and we all know why we want to do this. But once we do this, what does that mean? How do we maintain it? What does that require to maintain that ideology? And how do we prioritize that versus the orchard? How does that happen? And what is the holistic umbrella? At Little Round Top at Gettysburg, for example, because, and like a lot of the slopes at Olana, this has to be hand cleared. So now if you look at Gettysburg, they have written into their general management plan, their GMP, that summer kids have to come and do this every summer because perennial weeds grow 12 to 18 feet in the growing season. So what are those ramifications, and how do you prioritize that? How do you preserve that investment, and how do you look at it holistically? Now, I couldn't help, again, I think the farm is such a wonderful opportunity. I can't serve it justice in a nano minute here, but I couldn't help but think about the parallels with Monticello and how everything that happens there with farming and with the Thomas Jefferson Plant Center grows out of their mission and vision. There is an opportunity, Olana, I believe, to bring in a whole other audience, not to mention the economic potential with organic farming in the Hudson River Valley today. But again, how does that happen through a holistic series of lenses? And then the habits of plants, even grasses. This is a National Park Service site. This is the James Camp Ranch in Oregon. The landscape architect that's standing here, Kathy Gilbert, is after they returned the rye fescue to what was called the mother ditch. And after she went out into the field, she realized that the kind of fescue they planted grew bunch style and not canvas style. And so they didn't plant it again. That didn't satisfy the historic design intent. What about water? I mean, I'm assuming that if you start planting trees, trees have to be watered. This was an article in the New York Times last year about an estate that was given to the governor in Boise, and then they were going to surplus it because they couldn't water the lawn. Well, what are the other xeriscape options? And when you begin to open up view sheds, what are the opportunities? Site furnishings. What is the criteria here other than the fact that we know that there were historic benches, we know what they looked like. Here, for example, is Martin Scorsese's film The Age of Innocence. This is 19th century Boston, and Countess Olenska is sitting on the 1939 World's Fair bench. She's better suited to the East River Promenade. But this is what we do. I mean, with furnishings, we sort of treat them in a sort of whimsical fashion. I couldn't help but putting the Olana bench next to this bench, which seems, I think it looks like Mickey Mouse's feet. I feel like the whole Disneyland Disneyfication of Main Street in 1959 leapt over into our cities and became part of a catalog culture that didn't previously exist. Hideo Sasaki called it the 5 Bs: bricks, banners, balloons, Bradfords, and benches. I mean, imagine, for example, you start having night events and you have to have lighting. And so you start to have a discourse about what's the criteria. And I can tell you 9 times out of 10, it becomes an aesthetic conversation for what's a pretty historical light pole, as opposed to it being a philosophical conversation. Should the light pole recede? Should we have in certain areas spots and trees? Are there downlights where there should, is it about night sky? All of these have to come from a philosophy, so it doesn't just become a, oh, that's really pretty, I think that's attractive, I'd like that. And the same with signage. What's the criteria? Should signage at Olana be low to the ground? Should they guide the eye up to a view shed? Should they even have rustic posts? What's the relationship between these materials? How do we think about this as part of a toolkit in terms of a vocabulary that is employed at Olana? Because the thing that you see in all of these paintings is minimalism. So everything that you begin to add to it creates another level of noise that wasn't there. So how do you use lights and signs to inform, but should they be subordinated? And I couldn't help but think finally, in closing, this idea of populating the landscape and how we animate it and how we move through it. Here are in particular 2 of Church's paintings where you see these figure-ground relationships. And as I said in the white paper, I couldn't help but think about the donkey carts. When you're up on that terrace, and there's that wonderful passage in Devil in the White City where Olmsted is completely fixated on the boats, where it's not just about moving people. And this is actually a golf cart at Sunnylands, which I've been working with. They're opening to the public on November 11th. Now granted, a golf cart for a historic property that has a 9-hole golf course is an easy fit, but the question is, should there be some kind of mobility for people to get them out into this larger landscape? And what does that do, not just to provide that access, but how does that also animate the landscape when you are in a viewer superior position. And then finally, what is that view from the road? And how is that considered in terms of vegetation management and renewal? So it's not just about the road system and the road material, but it's also the visual sequence of spaces, a scenographic landscape, what Olmsted called passages of scenery as you move through the Olana design. This image was from 1890, by the way, and it's interesting to see elements of it that are still very much intact. And then finally, this idea of you have all these view sheds, what do you do to have people understand why they're important, and beyond it them being attractive, but instilling a stewardship value. Point Reyes National Seashore, which is 27,000 acres owned by the National Park Service, which was acquired during the Johnson administration, became a national park because we were losing seashores. It became a national seashore, but what's happened since then is we've lost cattle farming in California because of land prices. It's down to less than 30 farms. And so one of the things the Park Service does is they interpret this as the pastoral zone. So the, quote, open space doesn't read as an incomplete sentence, that it's waiting for something, but that the pastoral zone is part of that character. So the question I would raise is, in the context of everything we're looking at here in closing, how do we interpret the views beyond merely what we're seeing, but the preservation and stewardship underpinnings of what it takes to preserve and manage that scenery? And again, I can't help but think, tying back to those original comments about the Niagara Reservation. And then finally, which I think is already done to some extent by putting paintings out into the landscape, but are there opportunities for greater cross-pollination between landscape making, landscape conservation, and landscape painting at Olana, which, I mean, how many properties can really take something like that on? Certainly not at this scale. And to say you're not alone, this is a site that is now being grappled with. This is Ghost Ranch. It's all about the views. The views are not protected. And the Park Service is dealing with how do you instill value to preserve the views of the landscapes that were painted by O'Keeffe. That's all. So I'd be happy to entertain questions.